Children always recognize the people who once held their hearts together. Rain crashed against the diner windows so hard it blurred the highway lights outside into long streaks of gold and white. Ethan Cole barely noticed. He sat stiffly in the corner booth, one hand around a cup of black coffee that had already gone cold, the other scrolling through unread emails on his phone. Across from him, his 6-year-old daughter quietly colored on a paper placemat with broken crayons the waitress had given her 10 minutes earlier. It was almost 9:30 p.m. The storm had delayed their flight back to Manhattan, and Ethan had chosen the first roadside diner he could find off Interstate 80 just to escape the rain. The place smelled like cinnamon pancakes and old wood. Warm. Ordinary. The kind of place billionaires never noticed unless they absolutely had to. But Lily noticed everything, especially people. Ethan looked up only when the room suddenly became too quiet. Lily had stopped coloring. Her small face was turned toward the counter near the kitchen entrance where a waitress stood balancing 2 plates in her hands. She was young, maybe early 30s, dark skin glowing softly beneath the yellow diner lights, curly hair tied back loosely, oversized gray sweater beneath her apron. Nothing remarkable, at least not at first glance. But the moment Lily saw her, something changed. The little girl slowly stood on the vinyl seat. Her crayons rolled onto the floor unnoticed. Then, in the middle of the crowded diner, she whispered one word. Manga. The waitress froze. One plate tilted dangerously in her hands. Coffee splashed onto the tray. Ethan's heart stopped so suddenly it actually hurt. The entire diner seemed to inhale at once. Lily kept staring at the woman like she had just found someone she'd been searching for her entire life. Ethan stood immediately. Lily, he said sharply, his voice lower than usual. Sit down. But Lily didn't move. The waitress looked terrified. Not offended. Not confused. Terrified. Her eyes locked onto Lily's face, and all the color quietly drained from her own. Ethan felt ice crawl slowly down his spine, because he had seen that expression once. Before. 6 years ago. In a hospital hallway filled with machines and silence and the sound of doctors speaking too softly. The waitress carefully set the plates down on a nearby table before walking toward them with trembling hands. Her name tag read Naomi. Up close, Ethan noticed how exhausted she looked. Not physically, emotionally, like someone who had spent years teaching herself how to disappear. Naomi knelt slightly beside Lily's booth. Sweetheart, she said gently, her voice almost breaking. I think you might have the wrong person. But Lily shook her head immediately. No, she whispered. You feel like her. Ethan felt every muscle in his body tighten. Naomi looked away quickly, blinking hard like she was fighting tears she didn't understand herself. Then something even stranger happened. Lily reached into the pocket of her tiny coat and pulled out the worn silver music box she carried everywhere. The one that had belonged to her mother. The tiny melody began playing softly between them. Naomi stopped breathing. Ethan saw it happen. 1 second she was trying to stay composed. The next, her entire body went still. And under her breath, so quietly Ethan almost missed it, Naomi whispered the next line of the lullaby that only 3 people in the world had ever known. Some memories do not disappear. They just wait for the right voice to bring them back. Ethan stared at Naomi as the final note of the lullaby faded between them. The diner noise slowly returned around him. Forks clinked against plates. Someone laughed near the jukebox. Rain hammered against the roof in heavy waves. But inside Ethan's chest, everything had gone completely still. Naomi looked like she regretted breathing. Her eyes widened slightly the moment she realized what she had done. Then she stepped back so quickly her shoulder nearly hit another table. I am sorry, she whispered. I should get back to work. But Lily reached for her hand before she could leave. Tiny fingers wrapped around Naomi's sleeve with complete trust. Do not go, Lily said softly. Naomi froze again. Ethan noticed the trembling this time. Not fear of him. Not embarrassment. Something deeper. Like the woman standing in front of him had spent years trying to bury a memory that suddenly came alive again. Ethan slowly stood from the booth. His expensive wool coat brushed against the table edge as he rose to his full height. In Manhattan boardrooms, one look from him could silence investors twice his age. But now, standing inside a small diner off Interstate 80, he felt strangely unsure of himself. "Where did you hear that song?" he asked quietly. Naomi swallowed hard. "I do not remember." Ethan almost laughed at the answer. Not because it was funny, because it was impossible. He knew every recording his late wife had ever made. Every video, every voicemail, every forgotten clip buried inside old phones he still could not throw away. That lullaby had never been shared publicly. His wife used to sing it only at night when she thought no one else could hear. Lily tugged gently on Naomi's sleeve again. "You smell the same," she whispered. Ethan's breath caught. Naomi looked down immediately, blinking fast. Her voice became even softer. "Sweetheart, I think you are remembering someone else." "No," Lily said. "I remember warm hands." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. Because Lily almost never talked about her mother anymore. Not directly. Children forgot differently than adults did. Adults buried pain under work and schedules and control. Children carried it quietly inside ordinary sentences. Naomi slowly knelt beside the booth again, careful now, like every movement mattered. Up close, Ethan noticed faint dark circles beneath her eyes and a tiny silver chain resting against her neck. Simple, worn often. Nothing about her looked planned or artificial. She looked real in a way Ethan had not encountered in years. Naomi gave Lily a tiny smile. "What are you drawing there?" Lily turned the placemat around proudly. Crayon stars covered the paper. In the center was a little stick figure family holding hands beneath the rain. One figure was colored in with dark brown crayon. Ethan stared at it without speaking. Lily pointed at the drawing. "That one is her." Naomi's smile disappeared instantly. Ethan saw her throat tighten. "Lily," he said carefully, "that is enough." But Naomi gently shook her head before Lily could shrink back in embarrassment. "It is okay," she said softly. Then, for the first time, she looked directly at Ethan. The diner lights reflected in her eyes, and something inside him shifted uncomfortably. Recognition. Not certainty. Not memory. Just the strange feeling that somehow this woman had already existed somewhere inside the emptiest years of his life. Then the kitchen bell rang loudly behind her. Naomi stood quickly. "I should get back." She turned away fast, but not before Ethan noticed something beneath the sleeve of her sweater. A faded plastic hospital bracelet. Old, worn thin with time, and printed across the band in nearly invisible letters were 3 words that made his blood run cold. St. Mary Medical Center. There are moments that split a life into before and after, and Ethan could feel one happening in real time. The faded hospital bracelet disappeared beneath Naomi's sweater sleeve as she turned quickly toward the kitchen. But it was already too late. Ethan had seen it. St. Mary Medical Center. The same hospital where Lily had been born 6 years earlier. The same hospital where his wife, Claire, had taken her final breath less than an hour after delivery. Ethan stood frozen beside the booth while rainwater slid slowly down the diner windows behind him. His chest felt tight. Not from grief exactly. Something stranger. Like an old locked room inside him had quietly opened on its own. Lily looked up at him with wide eyes. "Daddy?" she whispered. "Why is she sad?" Ethan could not answer, because he did not know. Naomi disappeared behind the kitchen doors, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt the uncomfortable pull of something stronger than control. Questions. He sat down slowly across from Lily again, but his attention never left the kitchen entrance. The silver music box still rested on the table between them, its tiny melody fading into silence. Claire used to hum that lullaby while rocking Lily during sleepless nights inside their penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. Ethan remembered standing in the doorway back then, watching the 2 people he loved most in the world. Without realizing how temporary happiness could be. He had spent 6 years trying not to remember those nights too clearly. Lily picked up her crayons again, but her small voice broke the silence a moment later. "She knows me." Ethan rubbed one hand across his jaw slowly. You do not know that. Ido. She colored quietly for another few seconds before adding, she looked at me like mommy used to. The words landed softly, but they stayed. Ethan glanced toward the kitchen again. Through the small round window in the swinging door, he caught a glimpse of Naomi standing alone near the coffee station. She looked shaken. One hand pressed lightly against the counter as though steadying herself. Then, unexpectedly, she pulled something from beneath her sweater collar. A tiny silver cross. She closed her eyes for one brief moment before tucking it away again. Ethan frowned slightly. There was something painfully familiar about her sadness. Not dramatic sadness. Quiet sadness. The kind people carried so long it became part of the way they moved through the world. A waitress arrived to refill Ethan's coffee, but before she left, he asked carefully, "How long has Naomi worked here?" "About 4 years," the older woman answered. "Keeps mostly to herself. Sweet girl though." "She from around here?" The waitress shrugged. "Nobody really knows. She came after the floods down south. Needed work. Never talks much about herself." Ethan nodded once, but the answer only deepened the strange ache growing inside him. 4 years, which meant she had arrived here 2 years after Claire died. 2 years after St. Mary Medical Center. Lily suddenly slid out of the booth before Ethan could stop her. Lily. But she was already crossing the diner floor with determined little steps, carrying her crayon drawing carefully in both hands. Naomi looked up just as Lily reached the counter. Ethan started to stand, ready to apologize, but stopped when he saw Naomi's expression soften completely. Lily handed her the drawing. "This is for you," she said proudly. Naomi stared down at the paper family beneath the rain clouds. Her fingers trembled slightly as she touched the dark brown crayon figure Lily had drawn beside herself and Ethan. For one dangerous second, tears filled Naomi's eyes. Then Lily smiled innocently and asked the question that made Naomi stop breathing all over again. "Were you there when I was born?" The hardest truths are usually hidden inside the questions children ask without fear. Naomi stood completely still behind the diner counter while Lily waited for an answer. Outside, thunder rolled across the dark highway, shaking the windows softly. Inside, the old neon signs reflected faint blue and red light across the polished floor. Ethan watched Naomi carefully. She looked like someone trying to hold herself together with nothing but silence. Lily repeated the question gently. "Were you there?" Naomi glanced toward Ethan for only half a second before lowering her eyes again. That single look carried something heavy inside it. Guilt, memory, maybe grief. Ethan could not tell anymore. Naomi slowly crouched until she was eye level with Lily. Her voice was almost too soft to hear over the rain. "A long time ago," she said carefully, "I volunteered at St. Mary Medical Center." Ethan's stomach tightened instantly. Naomi continued before he could interrupt. "I used to help in the maternity wing after classes." Ethan stared at her. "Classes?" Naomi nodded once. "Nursing school." Lily smiled brightly like she had just solved a puzzle nobody else understood. "I knew it." Naomi almost smiled back, but sadness reached her eyes too quickly. Ethan walked closer now, unable to stop himself anymore. "You worked there the night Lily was born?" Naomi hesitated. For one painful second, Ethan thought she might lie. Instead, she whispered, "Yes." The diner suddenly felt smaller around him. Ethan remembered that night too clearly now. The storm, the emergency backup generators failing across half the city. Flights grounded, roads flooded. He had been trapped 3 states away while Claire went into early labor alone. By the time Ethan reached the hospital, everything had already changed forever. Most of those memories existed inside him like broken glass he avoided touching. But Naomi stood there carrying pieces of the same night in her eyes. Lily tugged gently on Naomi's hand again. "Did you know my mommy?" Naomi's face softened immediately. "Your mother was very kind." Ethan looked up sharply. "You remember Claire?" Naomi nodded slowly. "Everybody remembered her." Ethan said nothing, because that part was true. Claire had carried warmth into rooms the way sunlight filled windows. Nurses loved her. Strangers trusted her. Even during the hardest moments, she somehow made people feel calmer simply by being near them. Naomi looked down at the drawing Lily had given her earlier. Her thumb brushed softly across the crayon family. She talked about Lily constantly, Naomi whispered. Ethan felt his chest tighten so suddenly he had to look away. You spoke to her? Only a few times. Naomi swallowed hard. Mostly during the storm. Lightning flashed outside the diner windows, briefly illuminating the room in silver light. Ethan could feel old memories moving closer now. Uncomfortable. Heavy. The kind that waited years for permission to return. Why do you still have that bracelet? He asked quietly. Naomi instinctively covered her wrist beneath her sleeve. I forgot it was there. Ethan knew immediately that was not true. People did not wear 6-year-old hospital bracelets by accident. Not unless the memory attached to them mattered more than the object itself. Naomi looked toward the kitchen again like she wanted to escape the conversation entirely. But Lily stepped closer instead. Mommy used to say people meet for a reason, she whispered innocently. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment after hearing those words. When she opened them again, tears shimmered there despite her effort to hide them. Then, softly, almost like she was speaking to herself instead of them, Naomi said the sentence that made Ethan's heartbeat stop cold. Your mother asked me to promise something before everything went dark. Rain continued pouring outside while the diner seemed to fall into complete silence around Naomi's words. Ethan stared at her across the counter, barely breathing now. Your mother asked me to promise something before everything went dark. Lily looked between them with wide, curious eyes, too young to understand why. The air suddenly felt heavy. Naomi pressed trembling fingers against the edge of the counter as though grounding herself inside the memory. Ethan's voice came out lower than intended. What did Claire ask you? Naomi looked down immediately. For several seconds, only the soft hum of neon lights filled the room. Then she answered quietly. She asked me not to let Lily be alone. Ethan felt something painful twist inside his chest. 6 years disappeared in an instant. He remembered the storm warnings, the power failures spreading across the city, the hospital backup systems struggling to hold. He remembered hearing Claire's frightened voice through static during their final phone call before the signal died completely. And now this woman standing inside a roadside diner somehow carried pieces of that same night inside her eyes. Naomi swallowed carefully before continuing. The nurses were overwhelmed. Some of the newborns had to be moved manually because equipment kept shutting down. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He had spent years avoiding the full details of that night because surviving it had already felt unbearable enough. I was only a student volunteer, Naomi said softly. I was not supposed to even be in the neonatal unit. But there were not enough hands. Lily listened quietly while holding Naomi's drawing against her chest. Naomi looked down at her with visible tenderness now, almost instinctive. You would not stop crying, she whispered to Lily. The storm scared everybody. Ethan noticed the way Naomi's entire expression changed whenever she looked at his daughter. Not forced affection, recognition, familiarity, like some invisible thread had existed between them long before tonight. Claire stayed calm, Naomi continued, even when everything became chaotic. A faint smile touched her lips for the first time. She kept talking about you. Ethan looked up sharply. Me? Naomi nodded slowly. She said you always carried spare batteries for everything because you hated feeling unprepared. Ethan actually let out a quiet breath of disbelief. Claire used to tease him constantly for that habit. Nobody else knew that. Nobody. Naomi's voice softened. Further. She told me you would come back no matter how bad the storm became. Ethan looked away toward the rain-streaked windows because suddenly the diner lights felt too bright. For years he had buried Claire beneath schedules, meetings, investments, and endless work because grief was easier to survive when every minute stayed occupied. But hearing small details about her from someone unexpected felt dangerously intimate. Human. Real. Lily tugged gently on Naomi's sleeve again. Did you hold me? Naomi froze completely. Ethan saw the answer before she even spoke. Slowly, Naomi nodded. For a while. Lily smiled instantly like she had recovered something precious she did not know she had lost. Naomi blinked quickly afterward, as though the child's happiness hurt somehow. Ethan studied her carefully now. Why were you never mentioned in the reports? He asked quietly. Naomi's expression changed immediately. Her shoulders tightened beneath the oversized sweater. Because I was not important. That is not an answer. Naomi finally met his eyes fully then, and Ethan saw exhaustion deeper than physical tiredness. People like me disappear easily in places like that, she whispered. Especially after mistakes happen. Ethan frowned. What mistakes? But before Naomi could answer, the diner television above the counter suddenly flickered from the storm interference. The screen flashed briefly before going dark for 1 second. And the moment the lights dimmed, Naomi instinctively reached for Lily in panic so fast it looked like muscle memory. The body remembers fear long after the mind tries to forget it. The lights inside the diner flickered only once before stabilizing again, but Naomi's reaction had already happened. 1 second she stood behind the counter speaking softly. The next, her arms instinctively wrapped around Lily protectively, pulling the little girl close against her chest before the room even fully dimmed. The movement was immediate, natural, like breathing, like memory. Ethan stared at her in stunned silence. Naomi seemed to realize what she had done only after the lights returned. She stepped back quickly, releasing Lily as though she had crossed some invisible line she never intended to touch. I am sorry, she whispered immediately. But Lily only smiled up at her. You hold me like you know me. Naomi looked away so fast it almost hurt to watch. Ethan felt his heartbeat growing heavier now, slower and louder beneath his ribs. Every answer Naomi gave only created larger questions behind it. What happened that night? He asked quietly. Naomi remained silent for several seconds. The storm outside softened slightly, rain tapping gently against the windows now instead of crashing. Somewhere near the kitchen, old country music played faintly from a radio. Ordinary sounds.
Ordinari moments.
But Ethan felt like his entire life had shifted sideways inside this tiny diner. Naomi finally spoke without looking at him. The generators kept failing in different wings of the hospital. Her voice sounded distant now, trapped inside memory. Everything became confusing very fast. Nurses were running between floors manually checking oxygen levels for newborns. Ethan remembered hearing fragments about the outage afterward, but nobody had ever explained details. Maybe he had never been strong enough to ask. Naomi folded her arms tightly across herself. There was a point when the neonatal unit became almost completely dark except for emergency flashlights. Lily listened quietly from beside her, unusually calm. Some babies were transferred downstairs. Others had to stay. Ethan noticed Naomi unconsciously rubbing her wrist where the hospital bracelet rested hidden beneath her sleeve. And Lily? Naomi swallowed carefully. She was too small to move immediately. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Lily had been born premature by several weeks. Claire had told him over the phone not to panic because the doctor said everything would be fine. But the storm came only hours later. Naomi continued softly. The temperature in the room started dropping after one of the backup systems failed. Ethan looked at her sharply now. Naomi's eyes stayed lowered. The nurses asked volunteers to help keep the babies warm until more staff arrived. Lily moved closer to Naomi without hesitation, leaning lightly against her side. Naomi instinctively rested one hand gently against the little girl's shoulder while speaking. Another unconscious movement. Another impossible familiarity. You sang to her? Lily whispered suddenly. Naomi froze again. Ethan watched emotion flicker across her face too quickly to fully hide. How do you know that? Naomi asked softly. Lily shrugged slightly. I think I remember. Ethan almost spoke, then stopped himself, because somehow he understood exactly what Lily meant. Not literal memory, emotional memory, the kind carried beneath language. Naomi looked toward the rain-covered windows again. She cried less when someone sang softly, she admitted. Ethan felt something painful tighten in his throat. Claire used to say music calmed Lily before she was even born. Naomi smiled faintly at the memory before sadness returned just as quickly. Your mother stayed awake as long as she could, she whispered to Lily. She kept asking if you were warm enough. Ethan looked down at the untouched coffee beside him. Cold now. Forgotten. Just like everything else around him except Naomi's voice. Why did nobody ever tell me any of this? He asked quietly. Naomi finally looked directly at him again. And this time Ethan saw something different inside her eyes. Not fear. Shame. Because after the storm, she whispered, the hospital needed someone to blame. Sometimes the people who save lives are the easiest ones to erase afterward. Naomi's words lingered heavily between them while rain drifted softly against the diner windows. Ethan stared at her without speaking. The hospital needed someone to blame. He repeated the sentence silently in his mind because it did not fit the woman standing in front of him. Naomi looked gentle, quiet, careful with every word she spoke. Not reckless, not dangerous, but pain had a way of reshaping people into smaller versions of themselves. Ethan knew that better than anyone. Lily climbed back onto the booth seat slowly, still clutching the crayon drawing she had given Naomi earlier. You are not bad, she said innocently. Naomi's face almost broke apart at those words. She turned away quickly, pretending to straighten napkin holders near the register. Ethan followed her with his eyes. What happened after the storm? He asked softly. Naomi remained silent long enough that he thought she might refuse to answer. Then finally she spoke without turning around. A nurse reported that one of the incubators lost power longer than expected. Ethan felt cold settle beneath his skin. Naomi continued carefully. There was panic afterward. Families were frightened. Administrators needed explanations immediately. She gave a faint, humorless smile. Volunteers are easy to replace. Ethan understood then. Not the details yet, but the shape of it. A frightened hospital protecting itself during a public disaster. A young black nursing student standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Naomi folded her arms tightly across herself again. I tried explaining that I only followed instructions. Her voice stayed calm, but Ethan noticed her fingers trembling against her sleeves. Nobody really listened. Lily frowned from the booth. That is mean. Naomi looked back at her with softness that seemed almost painful now. People get scared when something terrible happens, she whispered. Scared people look for simple answers. Ethan remembered the media coverage after the storm. Questions about hospital preparedness. Lawsuits. Headlines. Investors calling him while funeral arrangements were still being planned. At the time, he had been too shattered by losing Claire to notice anything beyond surviving the next hour. Naomi slowly removed the faded hospital bracelet from beneath her sleeve for the first time. The plastic looked worn smooth with age. Ethan stared at the tiny printed numbers beneath St. Mary Medical Center. You kept it all these years? Naomi nodded once. I was supposed to throw it away. Her thumb brushed softly across the faded lettering. But I could not. Ethan suddenly understood something uncomfortable. This bracelet was not a reminder of failure to her. It was proof that the night had really happened. Proof that she had been there when nobody else remembered. Did they remove you from the program? Ethan asked quietly. Naomi smiled sadly. I left before they officially could. Ethan looked at her, carefully now. Because of what happened? Partly. She hesitated briefly. Mostly because every time I closed my eyes after that night, I could still hear newborn babies crying in the dark. Silence settled over the diner again. Even the storm outside seemed quieter now. Lily slid out of the booth once more and walked toward Naomi without hesitation. Ethan watched his daughter wrap both tiny arms around Naomi's waist naturally, like a child greeting someone familiar after a long separation. Naomi stiffened for only 1 second before slowly resting her hand against Lily's curls. Ethan looked away for a moment because something inside his chest suddenly hurt too much to examine directly. Claire used to hold Lily exactly like that. One hand against the back of her head. Protective. Gentle. Present. Naomi blinked rapidly, trying to control emotions she clearly did not want visible. Then Lily tilted her head upward and asked softly, "If you remembered me all this time, why did you never come find us?" Naomi's breathing stopped completely, and for the first time all night, Ethan saw tears finally slip down her face. Some people leave quietly because they believe their absence hurts less than their presence. Naomi wiped her tears quickly, almost apologetically, but Lily still held onto her sweater like she was afraid she might disappear if she let go. Ethan remained silent beside the booth, watching the woman in front of him struggle against emotions she had clearly buried for years. Naomi looked down at Lily first before finally answering. "Because your life already looked complete." Her voice trembled softly beneath the diner lights. "You had your father. You had a beautiful home. You were safe." Ethan frowned slightly. "You could have still reached out." Naomi shook her head immediately. No, the answer came too quickly, too firmly. She stepped back from Lily gently, folding her arms tightly again like armor. "You do not understand what it looked like from where I stood." Ethan stared at her quietly. Naomi glanced toward the rain outside before continuing. "After the investigation, everything in my life changed." Her voice remained calm, but Ethan could hear exhaustion underneath every word. "I lost my scholarship. The hospital removed my volunteer clearance. Some people blamed me for things that happened during the outage even though I followed instructions." Ethan's jaw tightened slowly. Naomi gave a faint sad smile. "Nobody wants complicated truths during a disaster. They want simple names to attach blame to." Lily frowned from the booth. "That is not fair." Naomi looked at her gently.
No, sweetheart.
It was not. Ethan felt guilt rising unexpectedly inside him. Not because he had caused Naomi's pain directly, but because he suddenly realized how little he had truly seen beyond his own grief all those years ago. Claire died. Lily survived. And Ethan disappeared into survival mode so completely that everyone else from that night became background noise inside a tragedy centered around his loss. Naomi quietly reached for the old coffee pot beside the register just to busy her trembling hands. "A few months later, I saw your family on television," she admitted softly. Ethan looked up. "Television?" Naomi nodded. "A charity gala in Manhattan." Her eyes lowered again. "You were holding Lily." Ethan remembered that event. His mother had forced him to attend because investors worried prolonged isolation would damage public confidence in his company. Ethan barely remembered anything about the night except feeling hollow inside an expensive tuxedo while cameras flashed endlessly around him. Naomi's voice became quieter. Lily was wearing a white sweater with little gold stars. Ethan blinked slowly because that detail was true. Claire had bought that sweater before Lily was even born. Naomi smiled faintly through lingering tears. She looked happy. Silence settled heavily between them again. Ethan suddenly understood something important. Naomi had not forgotten them for 6 years. She had been carrying them silently the entire time. Lily slid off the booth again and walked toward Naomi with slow, determined steps. Ethan almost stopped her out of habit, then did not. Lily reached up and took Naomi's hand carefully. "I would have wanted to know you." Naomi closed her eyes briefly after hearing those words. Ethan could see how deeply they landed. "Sweetheart," Naomi whispered. "Sometimes loving someone means staying far enough away that you do not disturb their life." Ethan finally spoke again, quieter now than before. "That sounds lonely." Naomi looked at him then, really looked at him. And for the first time all night, Ethan felt like she saw through the billionaire headlines, the tailored suits, the controlled voice, all the way down to the exhausted man beneath them. "Yes," she answered softly. "It is." Outside, the storm finally began easing into a gentle drizzle. The diner windows no longer shook from thunder. Everything felt strangely calm now. Then Lily climbed into the booth beside Naomi without asking permission and rested her small head against the waitress's arm like she belonged there naturally. Naomi froze at first, but slowly, almost fearfully, She allowed herself to stay still instead of pulling away. Ethan watched them quietly from across the table. And for the first time in 6 years, the emptiness inside him did not feel quite as permanent. Healing rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes it walks quietly into your life wearing a diner apron and carrying memories you thought were gone forever. Nearly an hour passed before Ethan finally noticed the storm had completely ended. The highway outside glistened beneath streetlights and drifting mist, calm now after hours of rain. Inside the diner, most customers had already left. Only the soft clinking of dishes and the low hum of old refrigerators filled the silence. Lily had fallen asleep beside Naomi in the booth, curled beneath Ethan's suit jacket with one tiny hand still resting against Naomi's sleeve. Naomi barely moved, afraid to wake her. Ethan sat across from them quietly, watching the scene with an unfamiliar ache inside his chest. For years, his life had become carefully organized emptiness. Board meetings, private flights, silent penthouse dinners, nannies, tutors, security schedules, everything polished, everything controlled, but nothing warm, nothing real. And now somehow, inside a roadside diner 200 miles from Manhattan, his daughter looked more peaceful than she had in months. Naomi brushed a loose curl gently away from Lily's forehead. The movement was so instinctively tender that Ethan had to look down at his cold coffee for a moment just to steady himself. "She trusts you," he said quietly. Naomi's eyes stayed on Lily. Children know when someone sees them fully. Ethan thought about that sentence carefully. Maybe that was why tonight felt impossible to ignore. Naomi had not looked at Lily like a billionaire's daughter. She had looked at her like a child she once held in the dark and never truly forgot afterward. "Why did you keep the bracelet?" Ethan asked softly after a long silence. Naomi touched the faded hospital band beneath her sleeve again. "Because that night changed me." Her voice carried no bitterness now, only honesty. "After everything happened, I spent years trying to convince myself I should forget it." She smiled faintly while watching Lily sleep. "But every birthday, I wondered if she was okay." Ethan felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. "She struggled after Claire died," he admitted quietly. "For a long time, she barely spoke around strangers." Naomi glanced up slowly. "And you?" Ethan almost answered automatically the way he did during interviews and business conferences. Controlled, detached, fine. But something about Naomi's quiet presence made pretending feel pointless. He leaned back against the booth and stared toward the rain-streaked windows. "I think part of me stopped living that night too." Silence settled gently between them afterward. Not awkward, not empty, just honest. Naomi looked down at Lily again. "Claire loved you very much." Ethan closed his eyes briefly after hearing her name spoken out loud. "I know." Naomi hesitated before adding softly. "She was not afraid for herself at the end." Ethan looked up immediately. Naomi's eyes shimmered beneath the warm diner lights. She was only worried about whether Lily would grow up surrounded by love. Ethan felt emotion hit him so suddenly he could not speak for several seconds. Because despite all his money, all his success, all his effort to protect his daughter from pain, he suddenly realized something painful and simple. Lily had been surviving, not surrounded by warmth, not surrounded by family, just surviving beside a father who never fully healed himself. Naomi gently adjusted Ethan's jacket over the sleeping child. "You did your best," she whispered, almost like she sensed the guilt moving through him. Ethan watched her carefully then. This quiet woman who had carried pieces of his family inside her heart for 6 years without asking for anything in return.
No recognition. No gratitud.
No place in their lives. Just silent love from a distance. The diner clock ticked softly above them, while dawn slowly began turning the sky pale blue beyond the windows. Ethan looked at Naomi for a long moment before finally speaking. "Come to New York." Naomi blinked in surprise. Ethan's voice remained calm. "Not as an employee." He glanced at Lily sleeping peacefully beside her. "As someone who already belongs in her story." Naomi looked down immediately, overwhelmed emotion flickering across her face. And as the first sunlight touched the diner windows, Lily smiled softly in her sleep, still holding Naomi's sleeve like she had finally found her way home.